Hey there, it's me, number 4, and today we're going to be talking about one of the biggest wars in US history and why it really started. Now, if you're old enough, you probably learned in school that the Civil War was over slavery and states' rights. And that's a good summary, but it's also a terrible summary. It's not even slightly specific enough to be useful. So today, we're going to talk about what actually caused the Civil War. And we've all heard of Lincoln's famous quote that a house divided against itself cannot stand. Well, this country was literally divided against itself in the early 1800s over the issue of slavery. And that's where we're going to start. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 admitted Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state and drew a line across the United States with the following stipulations. Any state north of that line would enter the Union as a free state and any state south of that line would enter as a slave state. This kept the balance of power between slave states and free states equal and maintained a delicate peace between the two sides. However, this compromise only lasted until 1850, when California applied for statehood as part of the Mexican Cession acquired from the Mexican War. The problem was that this new territory was south of the Mason-Dixon line and therefore should be a slave state. But because of the population density, it was obvious that even if admitted as a slave state, California would have far fewer slaves than the existing southern states. Therefore, admitting California as a slave state would upset the balance of power that had been carefully maintained since the Missouri Compromise. Senator Henry Clay of Kentucky proposed a series of resolutions that would address the issue. First, he proposed that California be admitted as a free state. Second, he proposed the Texas-New Mexico border be settled at the Rio Grande, giving Texas all the land it actually wanted in exchange for its claim on New Mexico, which was unlikely to ever be suitable for slavery anyway. Third, the slave trade in Washington, D.C. would be abolished. And finally, the Fugitive Slave Act would be strengthened. Basically, Clay believed that by conceding on the issue of slavery in California, while gaining concessions on other issues, they could restore the balance of power between the slave states and the free states. Most Southerners were appeased by this arrangement, but abolitionists were outraged. They demanded that the entire Mexican Cession be made into a free territory, thereby increasing the power of the free states. Eventually, both sides agreed to admit California as a free state, and that ended up being the deciding vote in favor of the compromise. But this was already a sign of things to come. The longer slavery continued, the more the South's economy and way of life became dependent upon it. Meanwhile, the industrialization and urbanization of the North meant that there was less and less of a market for human bondage. The North began to see slavery as an outdated institution, and as such, the two sides grew further apart. Then came the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe in 1852, which inflamed abolitionist feelings throughout the northern United States. The book was an immediate success and helped turn the moral tide against slavery. But then came the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which attempted to resolve the issue of slavery in the newly acquired territories of Nebraska and Kansas. This act repealed the Missouri Compromise and allowed for popular sovereignty to decide the issue of slavery in these new territories. Popular sovereignty meant that the residents of these areas would vote on whether or not to allow slavery. This act was extremely controversial because now slavery could spread into territories that were previously closed off to it. In response to this act, anti-slavery and pro-slavery activists flooded into Kansas to try and influence the decision. Violence erupted between the two groups and eventually led to the formation of militant groups, such as the Redshirts and the Border Ruffians, who committed atrocities against each other and terrorized the region. It was during this time that Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts gave a speech denouncing slavery and, in particular, he denounced the pro-slavery senator from South Carolina, Andrew Butler. One day after the speech, Representative Brooks of South Carolina approached Sumner at his desk, while he was sitting and beat him severely with a cane. Now, this event didn't just enrage the anti-slavery advocates, it actually galvanized the pro-slavery advocates as well. It seemed as though no matter what they did, the North would denounce them and use violence whenever possible. And that only increased the tensions between the two sides. Then came the Dred Scott Supreme Court case in 1857. Dred Scott was a slave who had lived with his master in Wisconsin and Minnesota, which were both free territories at the time. When his master died, Scott sued for his freedom on the basis that he had lived in free territory, and therefore could not be a slave. However, the court ruled that Congress had no authority to prohibit slavery in the territories, and that African Americans could never be citizens of the United States, and therefore had no right to sue in federal court. That same year, Illinois Republican and former hatter Abraham Lincoln was elected to the Senate on an anti-slavery platform. This alarmed Southerners who saw Lincoln as a threat to their way of life. In 1860, a group of Southern Democrats met in Baltimore and nominated John Breckinridge as their presidential candidate. But this was a losing cause from the beginning because most of the border states refused to support Breckinridge, seeing him as too extreme. Meanwhile, at the Republican convention that year, several candidates were put forward. There was William Seward, who was considered to be too extreme by many. There was Salmon Chase, who was considered to be too radical by many. There was even former President Millard Fillmore, who ran on an anti-slavery platform. But ultimately, the nomination went to the least controversial candidate, Abraham Lincoln. When the results of the election came back, it was clear that Lincoln had carried most of the northern states, whereas Breckinridge had carried most of the Deep South. But in the end, Lincoln won the presidency with only 40% of the popular vote. Now, 4 days before his inauguration, a delegation of Southern senators approached Lincoln and asked him to pledge that he would not interfere with slavery in the Southern states. Lincoln refused, saying that he could not participate in an agreement that would violate the Constitution. Needless to say, the Southerners left the meeting unsatisfied. And on February of 1861, delegates from 6 Southern states met in Montgomery, Alabama, to form the Confederate States of America, with Jefferson Davis as president. On February, the delegates adopted the Constitution of the Confederacy, which guaranteed the institution of slavery in perpetuity. And on April of 1861, Confederate forces attacked Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, igniting the Civil War. So let's summarize everything real quick. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 set the stage for decades of conflict over the issue of slavery. The Compromise of 1850 temporarily eased those tensions, but the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1850 reignited them. The Dred Scott decision inflamed the situation further and brought the nation to the point of secession. And eventually, Lincoln's election in 1860 and his refusal to negotiate with the Confederacy over slavery led to the outbreak of war. So was the Civil War really about slavery? Well, yes and no. Obviously, the issue of slavery was the main catalyst for the conflict, but it wasn't the only catalyst. The South was also afraid of the growing political power of the North, and how that would affect their way of life. As it turned out, the South's fears were realized and the Confederacy was defeated, and ultimately, slavery was abolished in the United States. If you want to learn more about this topic, I highly recommend reading The Battle for the Soul of America by John Meach. It is an amazing book and covers this topic in much greater detail than I can fit into a small video. Thank you all so much for watching, and let me know in the comments what you thought. Was the Civil War really about slavery, or do you think other factors played a bigger role? Also, thank you to our supporters for helping us make these videos possible.